Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Manitoba Agriculture and Resource Development Horticultural School webinar series. If you have any questions during this presentation today, please type them into the questions section of the GoToWebinar menu, and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you will receive a link to the recording. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Lori, and good afternoon, everyone. My name's Tom Gonzalez. I'm the vegetable crop specialist with Manitoba Agriculture, and I'd like to welcome you to the sixth and final webinar of this year's Horticultural School webinar series. Over the past number of years, we have presented horticulture extension information in person at the annual Horticultural School. This year, however, as we all know, coronavirus has caused some restrictions on how everybody is forced to operate, and Manitoba Agriculture is no different. And so with our partners at Agriculture, Agri-Food Canada and Assiniboine Community College, we decided to try the webinar format this summer and fall, and it was received quite well, I think, and we're looking at potentially having more webinars in the future. So stay tuned for details. We'll push them out fairly soon about what will be coming next. Our speakers, excuse me, our speakers today will include Anthony Mintenko. He is the fruit specialist with Manitoba Agriculture, and John Gablowski, who's the entomologist with Manitoba Agriculture, and myself. And I'll begin today's webinar with a presentation on planning for profitability in the era of the coronavirus. So let's get started. Okay, so basically I was thinking about what to talk about and what's the main issue that's affecting common to most growers and that. And even if effects haven't been that bad to date, I mean, I think we all have one thing to realize is that we're going to have to live with the virus being around like a reality, you know, for the next, at least the near future. I don't know how long, no one knows how long, but it's not going to be going away by Christmas, I guess is what I'm saying here. So planning for contingencies and the costs of those contingencies is probably quite prudent. Like you want to try to reduce the risk of the virus affecting your farm and decreasing profitability. Now, what are some of the ways that the virus will influence your farm and profitability? Well, the number one thing is health. I mean, for yourself and employees. Coronavirus could cause disruptions in say availability of everything from fertilizer to seed to you name it, just all crop inputs potentially. PPE and sanitation product supply could also be disrupted, or if not disrupted, the economics of it could become ridiculous. Say masks that should cost $10 a hundred might cost $50 a hundred, or who knows. But it doesn't just have to be a supply chain disruption. It could be an economic disruption that, you know, holy crap, that's a pretty expensive price. And the other thing that it could influence is demand, be it from the individual customer or from a larger scale buyer like a wholesaler or along those lines. Lori, could you bring up question number 1 for me, please?
I sure can.
Thank you.
All right, here we go. So I'm launching the question. So it is, has the coronavirus affected the lives of any employees or their families working on your farm so far this year? And if you could select yes or no and submit that, I will see the progress of these coming in. It's coming in quick. We'll leave it up for another 10 seconds or so. So we're just about, if you would just click one, and if you're having a hard time submitting, if it won't submit, you can also add it to the chat. You can put your answer in the chat if you can't submit it, if something's a glitch. Okay, so I will close the poll, and I will launch the results. So we have 50% said yes, it has affected, and 50% say no.
Oh, right down the middle. Okay. Now I'm kind of curious in that response. When I've had calls coming into the office this year, I would say the number one or two question has had to do with something to do with coronavirus. So yeah, that's kind of interesting that it's a 50-50 split there. Anyway, let's just go on here and talk a little bit about health and safety for employee perspective. Now, it wouldn't matter if you're the only person on the farm yourself, or if you've got 100 employees. Like if employees get sick or you get sick, it's going to disrupt the workload and certainly cause a increase in costs, if not disrupt the whole ability to supply your product. So striving to be able to minimize risk to employees is worthwhile. That's a good goal to work towards. And every, you get a group of growers together and you start talking, and everybody every operation's different, but there are similarities in every operation as well. And sometimes, whether you want to call it networking or talking with growers or whatever, but the sharing of ideas is one way to foster the development of new ways to do things on anyone's farm. So I guess here I'd encourage, whether it's locally, just talking with neighbors, or virtually online. There's oftentimes a number of ideas that percolate out of conversations and discussions with fellow growers. So I'd encourage everybody to be doing that. From a from a health and safety perspective, probably one of the more practical things is to try to do social distancing, but that's not always practical to do that. So oftentimes physical barriers, and a common one these days is plexiglass, is used, whether it's on a piece of equipment, say a transplanter where two folks are sitting close together, or maybe at a workstation where two people are grading close together, or whatever. But physical barriers can be used. One thing to not, I don't want people to forget about, is employee fatigue. And I don't mean just tired from working too hard. I mean mentally tired from dealing with the coronavirus protocols that are in place on anyone's farm. So it's just something to consider. The way things have been done in the past isn't necessarily the way they'll be done now, and longtime employees can slip back into the old mode, so to speak. If you have implemented change in a process, it's worthwhile following up on how that's being done, I guess. Contingency plans for continuing farm in the COVID era here are important, and some of the considerations should be, you want to get the work done, but it's got to be safe. And if, God forbid, something goes on the farm, how will the work get done? Like, what's going to happen? Is there a plan? And thinking even a little further down the road, like if I have an issue, are my customers, be them individual customers, if I'm selling at the farm gate or a farmer's market, or if I'm selling at a wholesaler or to a wholesaler, sorry, will my produce be saleable? Will they want to buy it? Like, those are all questions that it'd be prudent to think about beforehand, just so if something does happen, it doesn't come out of the blue. And a couple of resources. SafeWorkManitoba.com has some coronavirus resources on there. There is a plan, emergency support fund, that assists producers on farm to improve health and safety for growers. And there's a very long gobbledygook link there. As Lori mentioned, this is being recorded and you will get a copy of it. So I don't think it's worth furiously writing that link down, or just Google Emergency Support Fund through Agriculture Agri-Food Canada. Lori, could we get question number 2, please?
You bet. Okay. Question number 2 reads, was your farm able to purchase all the crop inputs that you required this year? Select one, yes or no, and submit your answer, please. I can actually see that people are voting, so we sure hope everyone takes an opportunity to submit their answer. We'll give it a couple more seconds here for everyone to vote. Okay, and I'll close that and share the results. So yes is 80%, no is 20%.
Okay. Well, thanks, Lori. And that jives with generally, maybe not the specific split in percentages there, but generally in my conversations with producers in what I've heard. So I guess the biggest, or one of the concerns when it comes to crop inputs, is the seed. Now, whether you're buying it yourself, or whether you're buying transplants that somebody else is growing, the genetics of that seed are certainly of prime importance when it comes to being profitable. You don't want to wind up with varieties that are not adapted well to Manitoba, or have disease issues that newer varieties don't. So certainly getting seed is something but getting the right seed is something that we want to try to have happen every year. Now, especially now with a lot of seed being from international sources, whether they have a Canadian supplier or not, there's not that much seed, if any, produced in Canada. And in this era of coronavirus, some countries, there's no bans that I have seen, but they're actively discouraging seed exports, not just a vegetable seed I'm talking here, but just general seed exports, because they want to try to keep that seed in their own country. So we won't be able to control borders or anything, but it might behoove you to look at buying seed earlier than later. Availability of other inputs, and the one that came to my notice here was plastic mulch could be limited, and that's twofold. The biodegradable mulch is not as available because of, I guess, the lack of demand, shall we say, and the old-fashioned made from oil plastic mulch, I guess, is going to be in higher demand. So depending on which way you're looking, if you use it on your farm, which way you go, do you want biodegradable or not? You might want to be looking to order sooner than later. Basically, like I said in that bullet, just consider ordering and even taking delivery earlier than normal just to assure you get it. And international orders are generally more affected when it comes to delivery times increasing than domestic deliveries. One thing too, I've had a few over the years, a few people talking to me and saying, "Oh, I had this great deal at Joe X Supply and wherever, Argentina or somewhere," and it doesn't always pan out, I guess. So, I guess just the cautious tale, look into online suppliers that you haven't used before. Make sure you're comfortable with them before you use them. And I guess we all know generally that equipment used in vegetable production is basically imported. Very little of it is produced here in Canada. And whether it's across the pond, so to speak, in Europe or just across the border into the States, everything's changed a little bit with coronavirus. And if you're thinking of ordering equipment from outside of the country, I'd certainly double check all regulations regarding to you're importing it, but also it being exported out of whatever country it's coming from, because you could get a rude shock if you're held up at the border or even turned back at the border. So anyway, that's just something to consider. How about we go to question 3, Lori, please?
Okay. Question 3. Was your farm able to purchase all the personal protective equipment or PPE and sanitation supplies that you required this year? So please select one and submit. I'll keep it open for a couple seconds more here. Votes are still coming in.
Well, that's good to hear.
Couple more seconds. All right. We'll close that and I will share the results. So yes is 60% and no is 40%.
Okay, well, thank you, Lori. And if I were to have guessed beforehand, I would have gone with something like 50-50. So we're pretty close in that in the estimate. So, like I had kind of alluded to before, there have been some times where supplies, especially PPE, which is used across a broad spectrum of industries, the supply has been very low, but also there have been times where, yeah, you can buy it, but it's at a ridiculous price. So I guess there's a couple of things to think of here. I'm not sure how many growers on the call are members of CAP, Keystone Agricultural Producers. They have a program for members where they bulk order supplies. The cost is shared 50% by the grower and 50% by government funding. Now, depending on how big an order is, if you're getting 50% of your order, the cost of your order covered, won't take very long to pay for annual dues to belong to CAP. I know just from a research perspective, we bought some gloves and masks and like just pleated disposable masks, and that bill, we didn't buy that much, and that bill was fairly high, and that's for a student and a couple of us. So yeah, anyway, it's just something to consider. And if you do want any further information on that program, the person to contact is Thea Green, and her email's on here, basically thea.green@cap.ca. So that's just an option. I'm certainly not saying it's the only option, but it is an option. If that's not practical, another suggestion might be to, in your given area or within your group of known growers, you might want to see if anyone's interested in bulking together to increase the order volume to try to leverage a better price in the sense of per unit, lower cost per unit price out of suppliers. A few growers did that this past year, and I'm not sure how much their price dropped, but they certainly did a bulk order. So yeah, there's a couple options there. So switching just to the market and customer demand, I'll try to wrap up. I'm going a little slow here. So Lori, could we get the fourth question, please?
You bet. All right, fourth and final question. Has the demand and or the requirements from your customer for some or all of the produce changed this year? Select one, yes or no. Pretty straightforward. Votes are coming in. We'll leave this open for about 10 seconds more. Don't have a lot of votes in right now. If you guys would like to select yes or no, a couple more seconds here. Okay, we'll close this and share the results. So 83% said yes and 17% said no.
Okay. Well, again, I personally find that interesting. I would have thought it might have been in that 60 to 70% maybe range of yes, as opposed to being that high. But I guess we're sort of in the same ballpark. And I, I think it goes back to the whole idea here that coronavirus has just changed how people look at things. I mean, from a customer's perspective, whether they're a big wholesaler or a retailer or even just individuals going to the farm gate or going to farmer's market or whatever, the demand for different types of produce, and that yeah, it's just being affected. The other trend that I think came out earlier in the start of the pandemic was when shelves were getting empty, people were going, why can't we just get that down the road? And that triggered, a lot more folks who had never had a garden, planted a garden, and realized, holy crap, it's harder than it looks, and they're prepared to buy, because it's not the simplest thing. We all know that. But I guess with more folks having thought, at least earlier on, about buying local, that's a hook that can be used both if you're selling at the farm gate or if you're even selling to wholesalers, because wholesalers even realize that that's a trend in the from customers in large stores that they supply. Excuse me. Coronavirus has caused a decrease in some market demand, such as restaurants. I mean, first restaurants were closed. I mean, shuttered. Then they opened slowly and not really to full capacity. And now I think even the hours are being cut back. I think I saw that on the news yesterday. But anyway, all I'm getting at is if you had been supplying restaurant, if that was a big hunk of your business, well, that's probably changed due to coronavirus. So when you're looking ahead to 2021 in the way of planning, just think about will the options that I've used in the past for selling my crop, is that going to work for me? Like, are they going to change? Should they change? I can't answer that for everybody, but I think it's a prudent exercise to at least think about this when one is planning. I guess it's a bigger picture question, but will customers continue to have enough money to put food on the table? so far, there's been certainly people out of work and less money, but so far it hasn't been widespread total zero income kind of thing with the government supports, federal government supports that have been out there. But that's not going to last forever. So anyway, it's just something to consider. And in Manitoba, don't forget that large acreages of root crop commodities, potato, carrot, onion, etc., they're controlled crops. Their acreage is controlled under the Farm Products Marketing Act. So you couldn't just go out and plant like, if you were so inclined, I mean, plant like, 20 or 40 acres of carrots or something. You could be under an acre of carrots and be okay, like 0.99. Or, for a potato, you could plant up to 10 acres and still be okay. But technically, to have the regulation in place would require you couldn't have more than that of, say, potato and without being a member of Peak of the Market. So just remember that. So again, getting back to planning, I guess what should farms consider? Well, customers' demand may change for the type of produce. So what would be the best type of or types of marketing options to use this coming year? It doesn't necessarily mean that what worked really well in other years is going to work the same in this kind of era with when we're all dealing with the virus. So just worthwhile at least thinking about that. And that could lead to a diversification of potential crop types, whole different crops or varieties within crops you're presently growing, or even potentially different avenues of marketing. Diversification can be good. It can have its pitfalls too, but consider some of those options when you're sitting in the winter doing planning for next year. And that's basically it for me. So what I'll do here is I'll introduce our next speaker. Anthony is going to present our next presentation, and it'll be entitled 2020 Fruit Crop Season Summary. And take it away, Anthony.
Thanks, Tom. Yeah, so I'm just going to go over kind of a brief summary of some of the major fruit crops in Manitoba here. So I'm going to talk about strawberries, raspberries, Saskatoons, sour cherries, and other fruit crops, and just briefly touch on how the pandemic affected fruit operations this year. So overall, for strawberries, we had average to below average yields, and this is primarily due to poor weather during pollination. It was quite windy during flowering, and on top of that, we had dry conditions during fruit development, so fruit just didn't size up very well. And as you can see from that photo, it kind of looks like it's tarnished plant bug or lygus bug damage, but it's actually from poor pollination. And on top of that, we had a later harvest with hotter weather, which doesn't help with sizing up, or berries ripening slowly. They kind of just ripen quickly at a smaller size. I guess it's from the farms I looked at, on average, berry size was smaller, especially with Kent. And we also, in some areas, we had a late spring frost, so that damaged the kingberry flowers on kind of the early to mid-season varieties like Wendy and Kent. So that first flower is usually actually your one of the larger flowers, and with that being damaged, you lose right there. You lost your what we call the kingberry, the largest berry on the plant. for some growers that had a frost. So that kind of added to the overall average of a lower yield and a smaller size for berries. I was seeing still good size with the variety Cabot, but still less yield than normal, but still some decent size on the Cabot. And of course, with the later harvest, we had greater spotted wing Drosophila pressure. So for some growers, they felt the need to apply kind of mid-harvest control application for spotted wing, where in previous years where the harvest is a little earlier, probably wouldn't need to do a spray at all, or maybe not until like the last quarter of the harvest or something. So that was definitely an added management input we had to consider this year. And going into fall, as we continue on here, as plants continue to go dormant, I think and I know a lot of growers have irrigation for strawberries, that they are irrigating their fields, not letting them dry out. And this will help the plants be able to shift to the dormant state with adequate energy reserves for winter so they can survive through the winter. And even for your runners, your primary runners, which are the ones that will produce a lot of your fruit for next year, along with your mother plant, they need adequate moisture to continue developing root and crown growth to survive the winter as well. So definitely irrigation is important for this shallow rooted fruit crop. Moving on to raspberries, we were seeing below average yields most fields, especially in fields that had damage from the 2019 fall snowstorm, like with a lot of broken canes. Definitely was lower yield, and then also it was a later harvest, and similar situation as strawberries, we had greater spotted wing Drosophila pressure again. And it's also important to provide some irrigation to the raspberries this year. Just it's been so dry and across most of Manitoba. Without adequate moisture, you're going to hinder your primal cane growth, which are your fruiting canes for next year. Definitely, once the plants go dormant, becoming up pretty soon as you see the leaves start to change color and fall off, definitely do one final irrigation prior to freeze up is ideal. With Saskatoons, we were seeing average to above average yields, and even seeing that in wild stands as well, some heavy production in the wild plants. Part of this probably was we had dry conditions during bloom, so this helps hinder disease development, especially Entomosporium, leaf and berry spot disease. So during flowering, it was a very dry period. That's a critical time. If you have any kind of rain during that period, that's when an infection can occur. We were seeing, again, this year, some yield loss due to spotted wing Drosophila more in the later part of the harvest. So that is definitely something growers need to watch for in Saskatoons. Hasn't been an issue in the past, but the last couple of years it has been. So just looking the next year and also just into this fall, growers should consider acquiring control products for spotted wing. Also, if you have an irrigation system installed in the orchard, it'd be a good idea to apply irrigation prior to freeze up. And I would consider this for all fruit trees. Kind of, they need a good watering after they go dormant, but before freeze up, just because of how dry we've been. And that'll just, when you think about winter, a lot of times it's not the cold that's a damaging factor, but the drying out of plant tissue. So if these plants can go in well with good moisture levels. That helps them out to survive the winter. With other bush fruit, we were seeing kind of like choke cherries and pin cherries, highbush cranberry, those type of things. Lots of fruit this year. Very good for wild harvest for those who do that. For apples, and I think this is partly because of the drought, definitely below average yields, definitely smaller size due to winter injury, drought conditions. They just didn't size up as much as they normally would, and then our prairie apples aren't usually that big to start with, so it was definitely a bit of an issue. Okay yields for many, but definitely not bumper. And we're seeing that for rhubarb. There's kind of a June is very warm, and the rhubarb just didn't seem to have a lot of spring vigor this year, probably a bit due to some winter damage, and the harvest was later, so they just did not have as much yield. They just weren't as vigorous, and regrowth wasn't as strong as a normal year. Moving on to kind of how the pandemic, COVID-19 impacted U-pick, pre-pick berry farms. There were measures put in place to protect staff and customers by the growers, especially with maintaining physical distancing, added signage stating physical distancing and not to visit farms if you're showing symptoms. And these guidelines were developed by myself and the Prairie Fruit Growers Association board to assist growers. So there's a whole list there on the PFGA website and the Manitoba Ag website as well. And there's a link at the end of this presentation to find those. And a link right here as well. So this is kind of just a basic kind of just guide to help growers through what they need to do to keep themselves, their customers, and their workers safe. So overall, the impacts due to the pandemic, we definitely had more customers in berries. It is unfortunate we didn't have a stronger yield for strawberries this year because demand for all fruit crops, especially strawberries, was just incredible, intense, historic. It was almost overwhelming for a lot of growers, the amount of demand by customers. People really wanted to have local fruit this year. Overall, reports from growers that customers are generally polite and respectful of the new berry farm rules and maintaining physical distancing and the traffic flow measures that were put in place. So that was good to see. And, you know, with the signage and, you know, the sanitizers, and a lot of growers put in additional hand washing stations and had to have additional labor to help with pandemic issues like directing traffic flow and reducing contact between customers and workers. Definitely were higher costs this year for most growers. More growers used an appointment system to restrict crowds on the farm, and the Prairie Fruit Growers Association installed a appointment software on their website for growers to use. So that will continue on for next year as well. It definitely helped whether growers use the online appointment system or their own, you know, phone appointment system or email or whatever. Definitely that seemed to help with kind of control the demand of people coming to the farm. So it definitely, I think, helped with reducing a lot of crowds waiting around at a lot of the berry farms. So kind of predictions for next season. I definitely see that there's definitely potential that the pandemic guidelines for that we had in kind of place for berry farms this year will be in place for the 2021 picking season. And we anticipate price increases across the board for all local fruit crops just because of this higher labor cost and supply costs, and just even, demand is greater than supply. So historically, local fruit's been undervalued. You're selling a premium product at or below retail price, and it's a premium product. It's for a lot of these fruit crops, you can't buy them in a store at that quality, or they're not available at all. Or, I mean, you compare a local strawberry to a store-bought strawberry, it's not even close. So definitely see higher prices, and I think that's a good thing, because the growers have higher expenses, so we need to cover those costs. And I know the Prairie Fruit Growers Association is improving the capacity of that online appointment system on their website for the growers. So hopefully with this additional over the winter, work on that to kind of improve it and allow more availability for growers. And that's kind of it for me, just a quick summary of the season. You can see this link for more commercial fruit crop information specific to Manitoba, and also the link from this link, there's also the links to the COVID guidelines for berry farms and a lot of other documents related to that. So that's it for me. Thank you for your attention, and I'll pass it back to you, Tom.
Well, thanks very much, Anthony. Moving ahead, our next presenter is John Gabloski, and his presentation is entitled Grasshoppers, How Weather Affects Levels and Management Options. So over to you, John.
Okay, thanks, Tom. I just have to get back to the beginning of my slideshow, which seems to be locked up right now. Can you guys see my screen?
I can see it. Just click your screen for one moment, John, and there we go.
Oh, here we go. Okay, I'm just going to reset it. Here we go. Okay, sorry about that. Okay, so yeah, I'm going to be covering the effects of weather and management options for grasshoppers. And just to begin with, we did have a lot of grasshoppers this year. Things have been building for a few years, and I'll show you some data on that in a minute. But what I really want to cover with this talk is how weather affects grasshoppers. And given that we've had a fairly mild, dry late summer and fall, what impact will that have on grasshoppers? If we get a cold winter, will that kill them? Some things that eat grasshoppers, and I'm going to spend a fair amount of time going over different control options and strategies that you might have for grasshoppers. And just as a side note, if you're wondering what these red things are on the back of this grasshopper, these are all a type of mite called a red velvet mite. You often see these running around on the soil early in the season, and they get on to insects like grasshoppers. They're parasites. They don't necessarily kill them, but they will weaken them, so they're somewhat beneficial. But before we get into what happened this year, I always like to remind people we've actually got a lot of different species of grasshoppers. There's roughly 180 species in Canada. Most of them belong to this group called the shorthorn grasshoppers, which includes all your pest species. Then we've got things like katydids and other grasshoppers. Katydids have long antennae, usually green. They're not considered crop pests. In fact, of our 180 species, there's really 4 that we consider to be potential crop pests in Manitoba. So not all grasshoppers are bad, but we do have a few species that, given the right conditions, can really build their populations and become pests. So the 2 that we saw a lot of this year were the two-striped grasshopper, the one on your left, and the clear-winged grasshopper on your right. In most of the province, it was a two-striped grasshopper that was super abundant. They're a generalist. They will feed on a lot of different things. They do have their preferences, but when their favorite foods become short in supply, if they're, say, in a wheat or oat field and that matures, gets harvested, it gets them moving. And then if you've got some, say, late season fruits, vegetables, whatever is out there that are still green, that's often when they will move in and start doing a lot of problems. The clear-winged grasshopper is a grass specialist, so they will feed on things in the grass family. They will rarely touch most of your fruit and vegetable crops. So for fruit and vegetable crop production, this year it would have been the two-striped grasshopper that was the biggest concern. And there's another one called migratory grasshopper that also can be a problem in fruit and vegetable crops. One thing we did notice in early July was that there was somewhat of a fungus infection developing in some of the grasshoppers. We were finding dead grasshoppers at the top of plants, but we really didn't see this infection kick into a big level. And I think it's because we did have a hotter, drier summer, and the fungal infection, it requires moisture to really build up and spread in that grasshopper population. So we do grasshopper surveys annually in Manitoba. We go out and we count grasshoppers in usually field edges and ditches, and we put together forecast maps for the next season. We don't have the 2021 forecast map out yet. I've got all the data in. We just have to get it mapped. But these are the maps from the previous 5 years. And anything green on the map, particularly this very light shade of green, means very low risk of grasshoppers. Green, the risk is getting a bit higher. And once you start getting yellow and orange on the map, that's when we're getting into our higher risk situations. If you start seeing red on the map, then you really need to be careful in your area. So you can see the progression. Things really weren't too bad. Now, the 2018 count, the count would have been done in 2017 for the 2018 forecast. Things were still low. When we did the counts in 2018 is the first year we really started to see that build in the grasshopper population. So things were starting to build. 2019, when we did our counts for the 2020 map, we saw a much further increase in that grasshopper population. And just based on the data that I've been seeing, the map for 2021 will probably be similar, if not have a bit more in the yellow and orange on it. So we're still in that high population cycle for our grasshoppers. It usually takes weather conditions, natural enemies, or a combination of the two to really knock them back. And that really hasn't started happening in a big way yet. It is starting to happen, but maybe not to the degree that we need. So I'll go over some more about grasshopper population dynamics as well in just a bit. As far as what the weather will do to grasshoppers, if we have hot, dry conditions, that generally favors more grasshoppers. Cool, wet conditions generally deter or are hazardous to grasshoppers to some degree, but really it's the timeliness of that cool, wet weather that makes the biggest difference. So late in the season, when we get into our late summer and fall, if it's hot and dry, the grasshoppers have good conditions for laying eggs. Most of the egg laying happens in August and September. If August and September are hot, dry, good days for egg laying, you'll get more eggs laid. Species like two-striped grasshopper, clear-winged, migratory, our pet species, they lay an indeterminate amount of eggs. A lot of grasshopper species have a very finite number of eggs that they'll lay, whether it's 30, 50, 100, or whatever. Once they lay that many eggs, they're usually done. Our pest species, it's that maximum number is quite high. So if they get good conditions, they just produce more eggs than if we get damp, rainy conditions or a very early frost, which can knock off the egg laying. But this year we had time for significant egg laying to occur. The other thing a warm, dry fall will do is the eggs in the soil will start developing. So you have a little bit of embryonic development happening in those eggs, which means they'll be hatching out earlier the next year. Now, what you see on the bottom of your screen is a cluster or pod of grasshopper eggs. An individual grasshopper egg looks like a grain of brown rice, but a grasshopper never lays just one egg in a place. They lay usually anywhere from about 20 to sometimes 50, 60 eggs in a big cluster. And they coat that cluster of eggs with a frothy secretion, which kind of hardens around them, and we call that an egg pod. So the grasshopper eggs are in these egg pods in the soil. So if you're digging these up when you're seeding in the spring or digging around in the soil, if you come across what looks like a cluster of grains of brown rice, that's probably grasshopper eggs. So that'll give you an indication of what the egg laying may have been in your area. Now, last year we had a really rainy September and early October, and we even had snowfall on the Thanksgiving weekend. And one of the questions I got a lot of last winter was, should that not mean less grasshoppers for 2020, which obviously didn't occur? And the reason that didn't occur is our pest species of grasshopper, again, they're all overwintering in the egg stage. That egg stage is quite resilient to excess moisture. A colleague of mine in Lethbridge, he took grasshopper eggs from some of our pest species, he put them in a glass of water for a week, dumped the water out, the eggs hatched. So once the eggs are in the soil, they've got a waxy coating around them. They're very resistant to excess moisture, so even if your fields get flooded for a few days, it's not going to kill the grasshopper eggs. They'll be there to hatch the next spring. Now, winter weather. You can kill grasshopper eggs with cold weather, but it has to get quite cold. The soil temperature has to get to about -15 where the eggs are in the soil to get mortality of those eggs. Now, keep in mind, our pet species of grasshoppers, late in the season, they usually congregate where there's a lot of lush green vegetation, which is often your ditches, your field edges. That's where a lot of the egg laying occurs. That's also where a lot of snow cover is. And even if you've got a couple inches of snow, you probably won't get -15 where the eggs are. So we generally suggest not to rely on winter kill being a big mortality factor for grasshoppers. Now, spring weather, a wet spring can be detrimental to grasshoppers, but again, the timing is critical. If it's a hot, dry spring, again, if you have some embryonic development from the fall and you get a hot, dry spring, you'll get an earlier hatch. It gets the grasshoppers going quicker. They become adults sooner. They start laying their eggs sooner. It helps build that cycle. So again, grasshoppers do better with these hot, dry years. Now, if we get a lot of rain in the spring, rain can kill grasshoppers, but it's timely. I'm quoting somebody here from Lethbridge, University of Lethbridge. At the time he was with Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada, Dan Johnson. He spent his career studying grasshoppers, and he's studied the effects of the environment on grasshoppers. And one of his quotes is that the impact of mid-May rains on grasshoppers will be negligible. And that goes for April, early May rains as well. The reason being, again, the grasshoppers, they're in the egg stage. Our pest species are in the egg stage in the soil. Eggs are very resistant to excess moisture. You can have your ditches flooded, your fields flooded in late April, early May. It won't do much to the grasshoppers. What can be detrimental is when you get plenty of rain between very late May and about mid to late June. That's when the grasshopper eggs are hatching. It's those early instar nymphs that are the most susceptible to heavy rains. So not that you likely want this when you're trying to get your crop in the ground, but very heavy rains, persistent rains through late May and June. Not good for grasshoppers, probably not good for your seeding plans either, but on the silver lining, it could take the grasshoppers down a bit. So things that eat grasshoppers and may help contain them. I've got a few photos up here, and all three of these pictures are things that I was seeing more of this year than I usually see in a normal year. So on the upper left is a bee fly, almost looks like a hairy, almost like a bumblebee, a hairy fly, almost bumblebee-like, but it is a fly, only 2 wings, not 4, can't sting you. They often come to flowers, but there's certain species of bee flies that specifically lay their eggs next to grasshopper egg pods. The fellow I mentioned, Dan Johnson, he's told me he's actually observed bee flies following grasshoppers, seeing where they lay their eggs, and then they lay their eggs right next to them. When the bee fly eggs hatch, the larvae go right for the grasshopper egg pods and will consume them. The black blister beetle, we were seeing much more of these this year than we normally do. And they're another one whose larva feeds, in this case, strictly on grasshopper eggs. That's why we see more black blister beetles in years with heavy grasshopper populations. But like the bee flies, they lay their eggs right next to the grasshopper egg pods. When the blister beetle larvae hatch out, initially they've got legs and they can move around quite a bit. They find the grasshopper egg pods. Then when they molt, they lose their legs. They spend the rest of their larval life in that egg pod, feeding on the eggs in that pod, and usually they'll end up cleaning up whatever pod they're feeding in. And also ground crickets or field crickets. We did have a fairly large population of field crickets this year. Field crickets will actually dig up and feed on grasshopper eggs, so they can help out. And if you are seeing a lot of these things in your area around your fields, that's good. And whatever you can do management-wise to minimize harm to them, that's a good thing. And I'll go over some options for minimizing harm to them in just a minute. Now, the fungus I was talking about earlier that infects grasshoppers, it's called Entomophaga grilli, and when the grasshoppers get infected with it, their behavior changes. They end up climbing to the top of the plants and dying clinging to the top of the plant, which is really of help to the fungus. Eventually, fungal spores build up in their body, and the pressure from the spores makes their cuticle split, and being high in the canopy, the spores then can spread and infect other grasshoppers. This fungus will take off and kill more grasshoppers under wet, damp conditions. So if we get a lot of rains and some damp weather for a few weeks in the summer, that can really get this fungus going. But under hot, dry conditions, you have less of this fungus as a pathogen as well. Now, one of the questions I sometimes get is, what if I burn my ditches or my fields? Will that help kill the grasshopper eggs? And the question is, not really. The species of grasshoppers that are pests lay their eggs deep enough that they're really not going to be affected by fire. The study that I'm referring to here by Branson et al., that was done in North Dakota. They burned some ditches. They dug up grasshopper eggs. Some of the species that laid their eggs a bit more shallowly in the soil were killed, but the pest species eggs weren't being killed. So you're basically selecting for the pest species doing that. So you might want to people will have their reasons for burning or not burning, but grasshopper kill shouldn't be part of it. One thing we encourage people to do is, in years when we know we're potentially going to have some grasshoppers, scout your fields, particularly your field edges, your ditch areas early, starting in late May, early June. That's the critical period to start your scouting. If you're digging around, look for the egg pods. When the eggs start hatching out, you have nymphs that are about 5 millimeters long, so about the size of a wheat grain. Very tiny. You have to usually get down on your hands and knees and look in the grass to be seeing them at that point. They're often concentrated where the eggs were being laid. If they're concentrated around a field edge, sometimes edge spraying is all you need to do instead of doing a full field. The ideal time to be controlling grasshoppers is once you see wing buds. So these things behind the thorax that look like little mini wings, those are called wing buds. When most of the grasshoppers have them, that's the ideal time for control. Hatch should be done when most grasshoppers have wing buds, and they still can't fly yet. So they're usually still fairly concentrated. So for timing wise, that's the ideal stage. Now, as far as what to use, if you need to control them, you've got a couple options. You've got brand baits and you've got foliar sprays. Now, I've listed 2 brand baits here. Eco Brand, it is basically carbaryl put on wheat bran that you spread as flakes around the field edge or in the field. There's actually an attractant on the wheat bran. I was told by the company the attractant is actually the smell of dead grasshoppers. Grasshoppers do eat dead grasshoppers. They get a lot of nutrients from them. And when they tested for attractants for grasshoppers, nothing seemed to attract them more than dead grasshoppers. So they've used that as their attractant. So the grasshoppers will actually come to the bran versus randomly finding it. They'll feed on the bran and ingest the carbaryl, get killed. The other brand that I'm mentioning here, Nolo Bait, is a protozoan called Nosema locustae. The protozoan is what kills the grasshoppers, but it's very slow acting. So you won't see a rapid kill with Nolo Bait. It's something you would use to try to naturally get this protozoan population built up over maybe a couple years or so. So it is an option, but you'll definitely have quicker kill with the Eco Brand than you would with the Nolo Bait. Now, Nolo Bait this year was not available. The factory that produced it in the U.S. burnt down. They're rebuilding it. I'm hoping that some would be available for next year for those who would want it. But for this year, it wasn't really an option even. Now, as far as foliar sprays go, most are quite broad spectrum, meaning they're going to kill everything in the area that you spray. There is one exception to that. The product Coragen is what I call semi-selective. It kills grasshoppers great. It kills any Lepidoptera great. Some beetles it works fairly well on. One group that it doesn't kill that well or at all in some cases is Hymenoptera. So that's your bees, your parasitic wasps, things in that group it is very weak on. So if you have concerns over pollinators, say you're spraying a ditch and there's flowering weeds in the ditch and you know that there's a lot of bees in there, Coragen won't kill them. Most other foliar sprays will, so it would be a good option for a situation like that. Regarding the baits and how to spread them, now you can use a Valmar or anything you would use to spread granular fertilizer. That will spread the bait. The company that produces Eco Brand, Peacock Industries, they've got these bait spreaders that they also make. So that would be another option. They've got ones that fit on the back of pickups, others that fit on the back of ATVs, and that will get the bait spread. And if you're interested in information on this, you could check out their website. It's basically grasshoppercontrol.com, and there'd be information on the bait and the spreader. And once again, it's carbaryl based, so it's not organic. It is lower risk. It doesn't kill natural enemies, won't kill bees. You can spread it into pastures when cattle are grazing. So it's got some advantages, but being carbaryl based, it's not considered organic. And regarding the sprays, again, most are broad spectrum. Do check the labels. Some of the sprays are only effective on juveniles, and this top slide should say only effective on juvenile grasshoppers, not adults. So read the label carefully. Some of the pyrethroids, Matador and Decis and some of those products, they work better on the juveniles. So read the labels and maybe try to avoid the products that do have those warnings if you're controlling mainly adult grasshoppers. Some also have temperature restrictions, and once again, the pyrethroids, that group that includes the Matador, the Decis, they don't work as well at higher temperatures, so follow those guidelines. and just be careful with pre-harvest intervals. Some of them have pre-harvest intervals of 30 or even 60 days. So make sure you're not applying one of those products if you're going to have clients coming in or you're harvesting produce in the next little while. Now, I'm going to end by going over a strategy that people are starting to use here in Manitoba for grasshopper control to try to keep their costs down. Some of the more selective products tend to be a bit more expensive. Now, the brand baits are fairly cheap, but unfortunately, when we get into selective insecticides, they tend to be priced a bit higher. So one of the techniques you can use when using some of these products is called reduced area and agent treatments. And the research I'm showing here was done in Wyoming. And what they did with the research was they treated 100 feet in a pasture, and then they left the next 100 untreated, treated the next 100, left the next 100 untreated, etc. And they replicated this experiment using different percentages of the field that were sprayed and non-sprayed, and they used different products. And here's the results that they got. So when they used carbaryl and they sprayed 100% of the area, they got 94% control. When they used carbaryl and they sprayed 50% of the area, they got 81% control. So it didn't go down in half like you might intuitively expect. They lost a little bit of control, but not much. And that's because grasshoppers are very mobile. They move around. So they were moving from the untreated to the treated areas and getting killed. And when you do the math on the economics of this, if 81% control is going to be sufficient, you've invested half the amount of money in chemical. In most cases, this strategy was the most effective treatment. When they did this with malathion, it was almost identical in their results. Fipronil, very high residual product, somewhat similar to our Coragen. When they treated 1/3 of the area, they still got 92% kill. So again, it can be an effective strategy. Now, the only downside is this has only been done on pastures for research. I'm trying to encourage research on this in Manitoba on cereal crops. I know some people were using this on cereal crops the last couple of years and telling me that they thought they got very good control doing it, but it hasn't been researched on anything other than pastures. But I do like to mention it as maybe an alternative strategy if people are using something and trying to keep the costs down. And the way this works again is the grasshoppers are moving from treated to untreated swaths. And the other advantage of using a system like this is that it is conserving some of the biocontrol agents, particularly if you are using a broad spectrum product. And if you're interested in more information on this, University of Wyoming, University of Colorado, there's quite a few U.S. North Central states that have information on this. It's widely used, especially in the rangelands in those areas. So just to summarize, grasshopper populations are increasing. They have been for a few years. So far, we've had good conditions for them in the late summer and the fall. Timely rains can help reduce levels, but that would be something we'd be looking at next spring. Rainy weather, late fall, early spring, probably going to have very little effect. Weather and natural enemies can take the population down. Sometimes it happens dramatically, other times it takes a while. But going into next year, be prepared that we could have another high grasshopper year unless these natural enemies and weather can help take the populations down. So that's all I've got. So I'll end with that. And I guess if there's any questions, we could probably take those.
I don't have any questions currently, John. I'm not sure if Tom has any for you.
No, at this point I don't. I was hoping there might be some from the audience.
Nope, I don't have any. So you must have covered it very well, John. Good job.
Right on. Well, I'd like to thank everyone for listening to today's webinar and that also presenters for taking their time out of today to present, and Lori for running behind the scenes. Just as a bit of housekeeping here, if you are a CCA and you're looking to receive credit, you can get credit towards this webinar. And the way you would go about that is to email Tracy Cummer at tracey.cummer@gov.mb.ca, and she'd get back to you with the specifics of how to do that. And again, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us for this webinar and any of the previous ones that you've joined us for. And stay tuned in the coming weeks. We'll be announcing some future events. Not quite sure what they'll look like yet, but anyway, stay tuned, and thanks very much and have a great day.